Not far from Nazareth is a kibbutz named Ramat David. Established in 1926 with a design by renowned German Jewish architect Richard Kaufmann in 1931, who designed some of Tel Aviv's most beautiful boulevards. And you could be excused for thinking this kibbutz was named after King David, of biblical fame. There's even a statue of that David in the kibbutz. But Ramat David, meaning heights of David, is named after another David, who reached great heights and fame at the height of the greatest empire the world has ever known. David Lloyd George, from Wales. David Lloyd George was Prime Minister at an important moment in the history of, well, pretty much everywhere. But for this conversation, David Lloyd George was British Prime Minister during the Balfour Declaration, which made the humble beginnings of a national home for the Jewish people possible. This is Benjamin, and today we're looking at how the Welsh Zionism of David Lloyd George, a very specific Welsh national Zionism, made the state of Israel even possible. David Lloyd George was born David George. You ever notice how a lot of really famous people in history tend to go through a period where they adopt a new name? You ever notice that? Anyway, he was born in 1863 to Welsh parents. But his father died at 1 year old, and he and his mother went to live with his uncle, Richard Lloyd, who influenced him so much that he changed his name to Lloyd George. Now, to say that Welsh-speaking society in the mid-late 19th century was religious at the time is an understatement. Richard was a minister who sent him to an Anglican school. Richard was into baptism and then the Church of Christ, which seeks to essentially unify all Christian denominations. So he was steeped in this stuff. Reflecting upon his Welsh boyhood, Lloyd George wrote, "I was taught far more about the history of the Jews than about the history of my own people, the Welsh. We were thoroughly versed in the history of the Hebrews." Richard George, a liberal, as in the Liberal Party, nudged him toward law and politics. So he's got this Richard fellow nudging him toward politics, who's a minister steeping him in religious conviction, and he's a member of the Liberal Party, and this is the 1880s, which is important for a couple reasons. Cymru Fydd was founded, a liberal Welsh home rule group, basically liberal Welsh nationalists, in 1886. And Lloyd George was part of Cymru Fydd, which shaped many of his ideas. Second, Zionism, basically the belief that Jews have the right to self-determination in their ancestral land, is not one monolithic thing. There's different kinds of Zionism. And liberal Zionism would dominate this movement from around 1897 to the 1920s, at the exact point in which David Lloyd George was in his anterth, his zenith. Anterth, zenith in Welsh, when he was politically active. And these liberal Zionists and David Lloyd George's Christian Zionism in the Liberal Party had the same set of values. This Christian Zionism was not new. Since the days of Lord Shaftesbury and before a century, this was building up upon the ideas of evangelical Christianity, which believed that the Jews being restored to Zion would bring about the Christian Messiah. This was not for the Jews' sake. These Christians were doing this because of the things that they believed around their Messiah Jesus. It was in their interest and not the Jewish people. But nevertheless, if Jews had allies, how could they refuse them? Now in the 1890s, when David Lloyd George was beginning his career as a Member of Parliament, those who are Welsh nationalists are often making vague references to the Welsh in Wales being like the Hebrews of Palestine, the Jews, especially during Exodus, and being led by Moses, okay, to throw off tyranny, a metaphor for England. Waldo Williams, the Welsh language poet, would make extensive use of this later. But for the time being, vast pogroms against Jews in the Russian Empire were forcing an exodus, and many of them latched onto the Zionist idea as, this is the answer. These pogroms forced Jews to develop a modern Zionism, and an Austro-Hungarian Jew named Theodor Herzl had an answer: a Jewish state. He even wrote a short book, a pamphlet, about the Jewish state. In 1904 and 1905, a Jewish state was considered in British Uganda. I know what you're thinking, Uganda? Wait, what? They needed somewhere to go where they could be safe. Zionist organizations contacted the British government, and they're trying to work with them, trying to show that they have similar interests at certain points. And Uganda is considered as a national homeland that they can go and create. Now they went there, the climate was not suitable, it wasn't reasonable, was it? There's no connection, really. It didn't work out, but David Lloyd George was the legal advisor to Theodor Herzl, the founder, basically, of modern Zionism. That's no coincidence. These guys had a common belief, even though one was Jewish and one was avowedly Christian. And this became known as the Uganda Scheme. 10 years later, the First World War broke out, and for David Lloyd George, everything changed. David Lloyd George had risen to Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the guy who manages the treasury, in charge of the money, when the First World War broke out. In late 1914, he met Chaim Weizmann, a lecturer in biochemistry in Manchester. The two hit it off quite well. When David Lloyd George became Minister of Munitions, he noticed Chaim was experimenting with cordite, an explosive material that could help them propel their artillery and other munitions. And he latched onto this, and it helped Allies win the war, and it spurred David Lloyd George's career. These two men developed a friendship that was very mutually beneficial. David Lloyd George, looking back on this biochemical discovery, he later said Chaim Weizmann was one of the greatest Hebrews of all time, applying his scientific skill and imagination to save Britain from real disaster. In addition to the gratitude I felt for him for his service, he appealed to my great reverence for the great men of his race who were the authors of the sublime literature upon which I was brought up. He's speaking, of course, of this boyhood steeped in biblical narrative, history of the Hebrews or Jews, and references that are giving metaphors for the Jews to the Welsh. You have towns across Wales that reflect names from modern-day Israel and the Old Testament. Bethesda, Chaim Weizmann would give up his British citizenship in 1948 to become the first president of Israel. That's not bad, eh? The first president of an independent state. Prime Minister Asquith, who was Prime Minister during the first part of the First World War, wanted to reform the Ottoman Empire. But David Lloyd George, who became Prime Minister in 1916, had other ideas. He wanted to partition it and divide it up. And he had a Zionist ally in his cabinet, Herbert Samuel, and they began discussing their Zionism in relation to this land. After a victory in the Battle of Beersheba, Lloyd George told Field Marshal Edmund Allenby, who he didn't really get along with, he wanted him to take Jerusalem by Christmas. It was done. Long before Allenby had advanced on Jerusalem, the British government had wasted no time discussing the future of Palestine. As soon as war had broke out, actually with the Ottoman Empire, they had begun drawing up plans to discuss the future of this region. And being that this was a liberal government whose base was a non-conformist religious base, Zionism was coming up in the conversations. And Samuel Herbert MP, and him being a Zionist, and in the cabinet of David Lloyd George, had repercussions long term. The Balfour Declaration would be heavily influenced by David Lloyd George and Herbert Samuel. It contained the words, "A national home for the Jewish people." Now I just need to put this in a Welsh context. These words, national home for the Jewish people, reflect attitudes that Cymru Fydd, that liberal Welsh Home Rule Party, were putting out. Because they weren't talking about Welsh independence. They were talking about national home rule, national home. And this is the same context and language within the British Empire, but a nation, that's being discussed here. Now, I know I'm a bit biased because I tend to side with liberals and I'm Welsh and I'm a Zionist, but it just feels very David Lloyd George, these specific words. National home for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration at once increased support for Zionism in Jewish communities across the globe. Lloyd George was still the Prime Minister after the First World War and the early stages of the British Mandate for Palestine, and he appointed its first High Commissioner of Palestine. And he appointed Herbert Samuel, the Zionist MP, as the first High Commissioner of Palestine in 1920. Hugely significant in every way. Now I left something out, intentionally, a bit earlier. Herbert Samuel was a practicing Jew, and he was now the first Jew to govern his ancestral land in 2,000 years. And it's because David Lloyd George, a Welshman, appointed him as doing such. Because of his Welsh upbringing, steeped in this religious context, aware of another linguistic culture, Welsh, yr iaith Gymraeg, the Welsh language, able to have a sensitivity toward Hebrew culture, possibly because of that. I don't think all of that's a coincidence. Herbert Samuel was a devout Zionist, expanded Jewish immigration, and created the first Jewish national home policy in government, without which Israel would never have been possible. And David Lloyd George had known Herbert Samuel for 20 years around abouts. He was well aware of his Zionism. This was not a coincidence that he appointed this man, of all the people in the British Empire that he had access to. He knew what he would do. And so the Friends of Zion Museum in Jerusalem, which celebrates Christian Zionists, properly recognizes Lloyd George's work to secure a national home for the Jewish people. And so in his own lifetime, Ramat David was named after Prime Minister David and not King David. I'd like to thank my Patreons. Thank you very much for contributing to the channel, and we will see you in the next episode.